This ramp is a
building
clear
simple
violation
ramp
of our
just so you
community
can leave your own
guidelines.
home.
I cannot believe
And then
this!
being told it's against the rules.
She can't be serious.
That's exactly what happened to Robert, a disabled man whose homeowners association ordered him to tear down his wheelchair ramp. They claimed it didn't fit the look of the neighborhood. But when the case reached the courtroom, the judge's response turned the entire community upside down. This is the shocking story of rules, power, and one man's fight for dignity.
This
the ramp
simply won't do. You can't just put this
that
up without
sparked a
approval.
storm.
I did not
The
have a
neighborhood
choice.
had always
Nonsense!
carried itself with a polished image, a place where hedges stood trimmed like soldiers and driveways gleamed with spotless concrete. It was the kind of community where perfection was not just encouraged, it was demanded. The Homeowners Association ruled like a silent government, its board watching every small detail as though appearances were the soul of the neighborhood itself. Grass that grew an inch too long drew warnings. Fences painted in the wrong shade of beige attracted fines. And to the residents, this was just how life was meant to be. Into this orderly world lived a man who had not asked for special treatment, only dignity. His name was Robert, a retired teacher in his late 50s whose life had changed suddenly after a tragic accident left him bound to a wheelchair. Once, he had walked freely down the tree-lined sidewalks, waving at neighbors, offering a smile to every passing child. Now he moved slowly, his wheels carrying him from his front door to the mailbox, each small journey a quiet reminder of how much independence meant to him. Robert's home, though modest, was his sanctuary. He had lived there for nearly 20 years, pouring memories into every corner of it. When the accident struck, he knew he would need to make changes to continue living there with some sense of normalcy, so he built a wheelchair ramp. It wasn't elaborate, just a simple wooden structure leading from his front porch down to the driveway. Strong, sturdy, and safe, it allowed him to exit his home without calling for help. To Robert, the ramp was more than wood and nails. It was his freedom, his dignity, his connection to the world outside. But to the HOA, it was an eyesore. The letter came one morning, tucked neatly in his mailbox like any other notice from the association. At first, Robert thought it was just another reminder about dues or landscaping rules. But as his eyes moved across the words, his chest grew tight. The HOA had declared his wheelchair ramp non-compliant with community guidelines. They ordered him to remove it within 30 days. If he refused, he would face escalating fines, potential legal action, and even the threat of a lien on his home. Robert sat in his living room staring at the paper, the words blurring as his heart sank. How could they expect him to remove something so vital to his daily life? The ramp was not a luxury. It was his lifeline. Without it, he would be trapped inside his house, a prisoner of his own four walls. But the HOA didn't see it that way. They claimed the ramp disrupted the architectural harmony of the neighborhood. It was not painted in the approved shade. Its design had not been submitted for prior approval. In their eyes, it was nothing more than an unauthorized structure, no different from an unapproved fence or a garden shed. Neighbors began to whisper. Some sympathized quietly, shaking their heads at the cruelty of the demand. Others sided with the HOA, believing rules were rules and exceptions should never be made. A few even muttered that Robert's ramp would lower property values if allowed to remain. The pressure mounted. Each day, Robert felt the weight of judgment pressing on him. Letters from the HOA grew more aggressive, warning of fines and legal proceedings. The board insisted that his case was not about compassion, but about fairness, claiming that bending rules for one homeowner would open the door for chaos. But Robert knew better. He saw the hypocrisy in a community that valued flowerbed, symmetry over human dignity. He remembered the same board once approving elaborate patio expansions, swimming pool installations, and decorative fountains, all under the guise of enhancing community beauty. Yet his simple wooden ramp, designed to restore independence to a disabled man, was treated like an offense. The deadline approached. Robert's savings were limited, and hiring legal representation seemed daunting, but he refused to back down. With trembling hands, he wrote a formal response to the HOA, citing the Americans with Disabilities Act and his right to reasonable accommodations. He reminded them that accessibility was not a matter of preference, but of necessity. The HOA brushed it aside, insisting that their rules superseded his claim. They demanded compliance. They threatened daily fines. By now, the story had begun to ripple through the community. Some residents felt ashamed at what their association was doing. Others avoided Robert altogether, unwilling to get involved. Local gossip turned his ramp into a battleground, a symbol of something larger than wood and nails. It was about power, compassion, and the true meaning of community. Finally, the HOA made their move. They filed a lawsuit seeking a court order to force the removal of the ramp and to recover fines they claimed Robert owed. The board members walked with self-assured pride, convinced they were defending the sanctity of their rules. But Robert walked, or rather, rolled, into the courthouse with something far more powerful than rules. He carried truth. He carried the silent struggle of every person who had ever been made to feel unwelcome for being different. He carried the weight of dignity itself. As the case was scheduled for hearing, whispers spread like wildfire. Neighbors, reporters, and activists all began to take notice. Could an HOA truly force a disabled man to choose between accessibility and punishment? The story ignited debates about power, privilege, and morality. Robert sat quietly in his home on the night before the hearing. He looked at the ramp outside his window, the wood catching the glow of the street lamp. It was not just a structure. It was his rebellion. It was his statement to the world that his life mattered, that his independence was worth fighting for. He knew the courtroom would decide more than the fate of a ramp. It would decide whether compassion had any place in the rules of a community. The stage was set. The ramp, the HOA, the law, and Robert's dignity were about to collide. And when they did, the outcome would shock everyone who thought they knew how far an HOA's power could reach. The HOA strikes
And
back.
I have my rights!
The morning of the court hearing arrived with a heavy air that seemed to settle over the entire neighborhood. For the HOA board, this was more than a simple violation case. It was a chance to show their authority could never be challenged. For Robert, it was a battle for dignity, fought not with weapons or anger, but with patience, endurance, and the hope that justice would recognize his humanity. The HOA board members walked into the courthouse in crisp suits, holding binders packed with documents. Their leader, a woman known among neighbors for her strict enforcement of rules, carried herself with the pride of someone convinced she was defending the integrity of the community. To her, Robert's ramp was a dangerous precedent. If one homeowner could ignore the guidelines, others would follow, and soon the perfect symmetry of the neighborhood would unravel. They spoke of bylaws, contracts, and architectural standards. They presented photographs of Robert's ramp as if it were a scar upon the face of the community. They insisted that his ramp lowered property values and disrupted the neighborhood's character. Their arguments were layered with legal jargon and authority, meant to overwhelm and intimidate. Robert, however, sat quietly in his wheelchair. He had no expensive lawyers at his side, only a volunteer attorney from a local disability rights group who had taken an interest in his case. The attorney's presence brought a calm reassurance. She reminded Robert that this was not just about him. It was about the principle of equal access for all disabled people. If the HOA succeeded, it would embolden other associations to disregard human needs in the name of aesthetics. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was tense. Reporters lined the benches, their pens ready to capture every detail. Local activists had gathered outside, holding signs that read, "Accessibility is a right and dignity over rules." For many, Robert's ramp had become a symbol of resistance against oppressive rules disguised as community standards. The HOA made their opening statement, painting Robert as a homeowner who had ignored proper procedures and imposed an unsightly structure upon the neighborhood. They argued that all residents had agreed to the rules when they moved in, and Robert was no exception. To them, compassion was irrelevant. Contracts mattered more than circumstances. When it was Robert's turn, his attorney spoke with quiet conviction. She described the accident that had left Robert disabled, his daily struggles, and the ramp's role in giving him independence. She reminded the court of federal laws, requiring reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities. She argued that no set of neighborhood rules could strip away a person's right to access their own home. The judge listened intently, his expression unreadable. He asked questions that cut through the HOA's polished presentation. Did the ramp truly lower property values? Was there evidence that it harmed anyone? Why had the board approved lavish home modifications for other residents while rejecting a basic necessity for a disabled man? The HOA faltered under the questions, their confidence wavering. Still, they clung to their claim that rules were rules. They insisted that making exceptions would lead to disorder, as though compassion were a threat to order itself. As the hearing stretched on, the courtroom became a stage for something far greater than a property dispute. It was a confrontation between rigid power and human dignity. Robert's presence, calm and steady, spoke louder than any argument. His quiet resilience was more powerful than the HOA's binders of documents. The session ended with the judge announcing that he would take time to review the arguments before issuing a decision. Both sides left the courthouse with heavy hearts, but for different reasons. The HOA worried their authority was being questioned in ways they had never imagined. Robert, though anxious, carried hope that justice might finally tilt toward humanity. That evening, the neighborhood buzzed with tension. Some neighbors expressed regret for not speaking up earlier. Others hardened their stance, claiming Robert was selfish for refusing to follow the rules. But no matter which side they chose, everyone knew the outcome of this case would reshape their community forever. The ramp stood silently in front of Robert's home that night, illuminated by the dim glow of the streetlights. It seemed almost defiant, a wooden structure holding its ground against the storm of power and prejudice. The battle was not yet decided, but the tide was turning. The HOA had struck back, but the fight was far from over. Whispers and division as days turned into weeks. The neighborhood became a battlefield of whispers and opinions. The HOA board continued to send aggressive letters, piling up fines on Robert's account, even though the case was still pending in court. They believed that intimidation might force him to surrender before the judge had the final word. But Robert did not waver. Each morning, he wheeled down his ramp to collect the mail, ignoring the hostile glances of certain neighbors. Some would cross the street to avoid him, as if siding with the HOA meant turning their backs on compassion. Others offered quiet nods of support, gestures of solidarity they dared not express openly for fear of retaliation from the board. The community itself began to fracture. Families argued over dinner tables. Friendships ended over whispered disagreements. Some believed rules were sacred. Others believed humanity should always come first. The ramp, a simple wooden structure, had grown into a symbol of division. Meanwhile, local media picked up the story. Headlines framed it as a clash between bureaucracy and human dignity. Television crews came to the neighborhood, capturing footage of the ramp and interviewing residents. The HOA board tried to spin the narrative, insisting they were only protecting property values. But the public was unconvinced. Comment sections filled with outrage, calling the HOA heartless and cruel. Robert watched all of this with quiet amazement. He had never sought the spotlight, but now his private struggle had become a public debate. Activists began reaching out, offering to rally support. Disability rights organizations drafted statements condemning the HOA's actions. Even city officials started paying attention, recognizing the broader implications of the case. The pressure on the HOA grew. Some board members began to question their own stance. Were they truly protecting the neighborhood, or had they crossed a line into cruelty? Yet their leader, determined to defend her power, refused to back down. She insisted that giving in would unravel everything they had built. To her, the ramp was not about accessibility, but about control. As the division deepened, the neighborhood lost its charm. What had once been a picture of order now felt hostile and fractured. Neighbors who once waved to one another now avoided eye contact. Community gatherings were tense, with conversations turning into arguments. The HOA's obsession with control had not preserved harmony, it had destroyed it. Robert, though saddened by the turmoil, held firm. He knew the court's decision would not only affect him, but countless others who might face similar battles. His fight was no longer just personal. It was a stand against a system that valued appearances over people. The whispers grew louder, the tension heavier. The ramp stood at the center of it all, silent but unyielding, waiting for the day when justice would finally speak. The courtroom. Showdown. The day of the final hearing arrived, and the courtroom was packed. Reporters filled the benches, activists stood outside chanting slogans, and curious residents gathered to witness the climax of a battle that had shaken their community. The HOA entered with an air of forced confidence, their leader clutching documents like shields. Robert rolled in quietly, his attorney at his side, carrying only a folder of legal precedents and a heart full of determination. The judge began by addressing both sides firmly. He reminded the court that this case was not just about bylaws, but about the balance between community rules and fundamental human rights. His tone carried weight, and everyone in the room leaned forward, sensing the significance of what was to come. The HOA made one last attempt to defend their actions. They argued that allowing Robert's ramp would open the door for uncontrolled modifications by other residents. They insisted that rules existed for a reason, and bending them would destroy fairness. But Robert's attorney countered with calm precision. She cited laws requiring reasonable accommodations, presented expert testimony that the ramp did not lower property values, and emphasized the moral responsibility to protect the dignity of disabled residents. She argued that denying Robert's ramp was not just unreasonable, it was discriminatory. The judge listened carefully, his eyes shifting between the polished arguments of the HOA and the heartfelt truth of Robert's case. Then, with deliberate clarity, he delivered his ruling. The ramp would stay. The courtroom erupted in gasps and murmurs. The judge declared that the HOA had violated Robert's rights by demanding the removal of his ramp. He condemned their actions as discriminatory and ordered them not only to cease their fines, but also to cover Robert's legal expenses. He reminded them that rules must never override the basic dignity of human life. For Robert, it was more than a legal victory. It was a restoration of his humanity in the eyes of a system that had tried to erase it. Tears welled in his eyes as he realized he had not fought in vain. The ramp that had once been treated as a violation was now recognized as a right. The HOA board sat stunned, their authority shattered. The community, once divided, erupted into conversations of relief, shame, and reflection. The case was over, but its impact was only beginning. The fallout, the ruling sent shockwaves through the neighborhood. For some, it was a moment of relief and vindication. For others, especially those who had sided with the HOA, it was a bitter humiliation. The board's authority had been broken, and their credibility was in ruins. The HOA leader who had spearheaded the fight faced mounting criticism. Residents questioned her judgment, accusing her of bringing unnecessary shame and legal costs upon the community. Some even called for her resignation. The once powerful board now found itself fractured, its members divided and defensive. Meanwhile, Robert became an unlikely hero. Neighbors who had once avoided him now approached with words of support and apologies. Children waved as he wheeled by, their parents encouraging kindness. The ramp, once a symbol of conflict, became a beacon of change. Beyond the neighborhood, the story spread across the nation. News outlets framed it as a victory for disability rights. Advocates used it to push for stronger protections against HOA overreach. Robert received letters from strangers thanking him for standing his ground. His quiet battle had become part of a larger movement. Yet Robert remained humble. He had not sought fame or recognition. He only wanted the freedom to live in his home, with dignity. But now he carried the weight of representing countless others who faced similar struggles. He realized that his fight had been bigger than himself all along. The HOA, humiliated and weakened, reluctantly complied with the court's order. The fines were erased, the threats withdrawn, and the ramp officially recognized as a permanent structure. The board, once feared, now struggled to regain control in a community that no longer saw them as infallible. But the damage was done. The illusion of perfection that once defined the neighborhood had been shattered. Residents saw the board not as guardians of order, but as enforcers of cruelty. The very power they had clung to had destroyed their credibility. The ramp that changed everything. In the months that followed, the neighborhood slowly healed. The anger faded, the divisions softened, and life returned to a quieter rhythm. But things would never be the same again. The ramp stood at Robert's home, not just as a structure of wood, but as a monument to resilience. It reminded everyone that compassion mattered more than perfection. It reminded them that rules could not stand above humanity. And it reminded them that one man's quiet fight could ripple far beyond a single neighborhood. Robert continued to live his life with dignity, moving freely down his ramp each day. He no longer felt the weight of judgment from his neighbors. Instead, he felt the warmth of respect. His struggle had taught them all something they had forgotten: that a community is not built on fences and bylaws, but on empathy and understanding. The HOA, humbled, operated with more caution. They still enforced rules, but the sting of their defeat lingered. They knew they could never again place aesthetics above human need without facing consequences. Their reign of fear was over, replaced by a fragile attempt to rebuild trust. And so the ramp remained, weathering rain and sun, standing strong as a silent witness to the storm it had survived. What had once been a source of conflict became a symbol of triumph. It was proof that dignity, once fought for, could never be taken away. For Robert, the victory was not in defeating the HOA, but in reclaiming his freedom. For the neighborhood, the lesson was lasting. True harmony is not found in perfect lawns or matching fences, but in the strength of compassion. The ramp had changed everything, and it would continue to stand, not just for Robert, but for everyone who had ever been told they did not belong.